There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with quiet. It is not the silence of a Sunday morning when the world holds its breath before the church bells ring, and even the birds seem to understand that some hours are meant for stillness. It is not the silence of fresh snow on open pasture, that soft and merciful hush that makes a man feel like the only living soul for 100 miles in every direction. Those silences carry peace inside them. A man can breathe inside those silences and feel for a moment that the world is as it should be. The silence that filled the Holt Ranch on the morning of July 14th, 1887, was something else entirely. It pressed against Elias Holt's chest from the inside like a stone placed there by an invisible hand. It made him breathe shallow. It made him lie still in his narrow bed for a full 30 seconds after his eyes opened, which was 30 seconds longer than he had lain still in the morning in 22 years of running this place. He had heard this silence twice before in his life. Once when he was 14 years old, and his father called him to the back bedroom to say goodbye to his mother. And once 6 years ago when Anne had stopped breathing on the fourth morning of a fever that the county doctor had called manageable, right up until it killed her. Both times the silence came first, before the knowledge, before the grief. The silence arrived like a messenger sent ahead of the news it carried, and somehow the body understood what the mind had not yet been told. Elias sat up. He pulled on his flannel shirt without bothering with the buttons at the collar. The floor was cold under his bare feet, which was wrong for the middle of July in the Texas hill country, but he did not pause to think about it. He shoved his feet into his boots without untying the laces from the night before the way a man does when speed matters more than habit. He was out the door and crossing the yard before the sky had finished deciding what color it wanted to be. The darkness was thinning at the eastern edge, but had not yet surrendered. The land stretched out around him in shades of gray and charcoal, the familiar hills reduced to shapes he knew by memory rather than by sight. He had walked this path from the house to the stable so many thousands of times that his feet knew every stone, every shallow depression where rainwater collected after a storm, every place where the packed earth was harder or softer beneath his boot soles. He did not need light for this walk. He could have made it blind. But he had never made it with this silence pressing against him. The smell reached him from 10 paces away. He stopped walking, not because the smell was unfamiliar, because it was too familiar. Sweet and sour tangled together, not the ordinary smell of a working stable, but a deeper smell underneath that organic and wrong, like something fermenting from the inside in the wrong direction. He had smelled it once before 15 years back when he had ridden north with his father to look at a string of horses on a spread near Mason. The owner of that ranch had been standing at his fence with the particular stillnesses of a man who has run out of things to try. 3 days later, the man's entire herd was gone. Elias stood in the darkness outside the stable and made himself breathe slowly. A man who panics is a man who makes mistakes he cannot afford. His father had taught him that. His father had taught him most of the things that mattered. Then he pushed the door open and went inside. Drummer was lying on the ground. In 18 years, the big brown horse had never lain down when someone entered the stable. Not once. It was simply something Drummer did not do. When Elias came through that door in the mornings, the horse would already be on his feet, head turning, ears forward, the heavy warmth of his breath visible in winter and invisible but felt in summer. The horse would push his muzzle against Elias's shoulder in greeting, not the eager nudging of an animal expecting a treat, but something slower and more deliberate, the gesture of a creature who recognized you and wanted you to know it. Elias's father had bought Drummer as a 4-month-old foal from a breeder in Austin. Elias had been 21 years old that summer, 2 years into working the ranch alongside his father, and the two of them had sat together in the stable on the first night because Jacob Holt had decided the young horse needed company until it settled. He remembered his father's face in the lamplight that night, watching the foal breathe in the unfamiliar dark, with an expression that Elias had not yet had enough years to fully understand. Years later, he understood what it was. It was the look of a man who has committed himself to something and is taking the full measure of that commitment. Now that same horse lay stretched on the stone floor of the first stall, and the sight of it drove something sharp and cold through the center of Elias's chest. He crossed the stable in 4 long strides and knelt beside the horse. He put his hand on Drummer's neck, on the thick crest of muscle that he had touched 10,000 times, that he knew better than his own face in the mirror. The heat that came up through his palm was wrong. Not the dry warmth of a healthy horse on a July morning. This was a fever heat, the deep burning of a body turning its full resources against something it could not defeat. The horse did not open his eyes. His breathing was too shallow, the ribs lifting and falling in small, insufficient movements, like a man trying to breathe through cloth. Elias stayed on his knees beside Drummer for a long moment. He did not speak. There was nothing useful to say, and he had never been a man who spoke without a purpose. He placed his other hand flat against the horse's side and felt the heat radiating upward and the faint, wrong rhythm of the heartbeat underneath. Then he stood and made himself walk down the length of the stable. Stall by stall, horse by horse, each one telling the same story in the same handwriting. Out of 15 horses, 8 were down. They lay on their sides or with their legs folded beneath them, eyes closed or open, and dull coats dark with sweat, or patchy and dry in equal measure. The remaining 7 were still on their feet, but it was not the standing of healthy animals. It was the standing of things that had not yet fallen. Their heads hung low, their ears pressed flat. Their legs trembled with the fine, constant shaking of muscles that had been working too hard for too long to hold up against something they could not understand. 3 generations, 36 years. His grandfather had driven cattle into this county when it was still territory that argued with itself about who it belonged to. His father had bought the land, broken the land, built the house and the stable and the fences and the wells. Elias had taken what his father built and poured 2 decades of his own labor into it, buying carefully, breeding, patiently building a reputation for Holt horses that reached as far as San Antonio and east to Austin. Men who had never met him in person knew his name because of the horses he raised. And now 15 of those horses were either dying or close enough to make no practical difference. Elias walked back to the house. He sat at the kitchen table in the growing light without lighting the lamp. He pulled a worn letter from the inside pocket of his flannel shirt, the paper soft at the folds from being handled too many times, and he read it again. He had read it 17 times already, perhaps more. He had stopped keeping count around the 12th. The handwriting was plain and straight, not ornamented. The words were plain and straight as well. Dear Mr. Holt, I accept your proposal. I will arrive on the 2:15 train from Dayton, Ohio on the 14th of July. I am not a fancy woman. I do not require fancy things. I can cook and clean and keep a house in order. I hope that will be enough. Respectfully, Clara Bennett. Today was the 14th. In 9 hours, a woman he had never met was going to step off the afternoon train and look around for a man who had something to offer. A man with a working ranch. A man with a future worth walking toward. A man with something in his hands other than the slow, helpless fact of watching everything he had been left to hold slip through his fingers like dry sand. Elias folded the letter carefully, the way you fold something that cannot be replaced, and returned it to his pocket. He sat in the kitchen in the growing morning light and made no sound at all. 3 days before this morning, Dr. Warren Cole had come to the Holt Ranch and walked through that same stable with his black leather bag and his carefully maintained beard and his 23 years of professional reputation, and he had stood at the end of the aisle and shaken his head. Cole was a fixture in Kerr County, the way a church or a courthouse is a fixture, something people built their expectations around without ever really examining whether those expectations were still warranted. He had been the only veterinarian in a 40-mile radius for as long as most people on these ranches could remember. He had saved livestock. He had made the right call in situations where the wrong call would have cost families their livelihoods. He was by any reasonable measure a man worth trusting. He had gone through the stable exactly as a professional goes through a sick herd, thorough and methodical, checking eyes and gums and breathing patterns, collecting urine samples, making notes in his leather-covered book. He had pressed his stethoscope to chests and listened with the focused expression of a man translating a foreign language. And then he had walked outside into the July heat and told Elias Holt that he had never seen anything like this, that he could not treat what he could not name, that the best thing Elias could do was pray. What Cole did not say, what he chose not to say while standing in the yard of the Holt Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in July with his hat in his hand and his professional face arranged into careful sympathy, was this: he had seen it before. Not exactly like this, not identical in every particular, but close enough that a man who had been doing this work for 23 years, a man who had sat with enough sick horses and dying cattle to fill a small town's worth of grief, should have recognized the patterns being laid out before him in that stable. 4 years ago, the Richardson spread north of town had lost an entire beef herd in less than a week. Cole had been called in then too. He had gone through the same motions, made the same careful notes, and ultimately shaken his head in the same way he had shaken his head at Elias Holt. He had declared it a mystery and ridden away. But afterward, when the Richardsons had sold the property and moved east and the spread sat empty and the gossip had moved on to other things, Cole had gone back. He had gone back because something had been bothering him since the day he stood in that stable, and a man with a conscience, even a conscience that has learned to negotiate with his professional pride, does not easily leave that kind of thing alone. He had found what he was looking for along the banks of the stream that ran through the back of the Richardson property in the specific way the algae grew on certain rocks and the particular color of the sediment at the bends where water slowed. He had done enough reading in the 2 years since to understand what he was looking at. The old Black Rock copper mine, abandoned since 1877, sat 5 miles up the watershed. A heavy spring meant copper compounds moving through the rock and into the water, invisible to the eye, tasteless in ordinary amounts but accumulated over months in the bodies of animals drinking from that source, enough to compromise immunity, enough to make a manageable seasonal fever into something that a herd could not fight its way through. He had also understood in that same reading that the prophylactic treatment he had recommended to the Richardsons 6 weeks before their cattle began dying had interacted badly with chronic copper exposure, not caused the deaths on its own, but weakened the defenses significantly, made the animals less capable of surviving what they might otherwise have survived. He had understood this. He had sat with this understanding for 4 years. And 2 weeks before the Holt herd began to collapse, he had given Elias Holt's horses the same prophylactic treatment. Warren Cole stood in the yard of the Holt Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon and told Elias that prayer was his best remaining option, and then he rode away toward Kerrville, and his professional reputation was intact, and his 23 years of standing in this community remained undisturbed, and one of Elias Holt's horses died before the sun went down that same evening. Elias knew none of this. He sat at his kitchen table in the growing morning light and read Clara Bennett's letter for the 18th time and then put it away and went to change into his cleanest shirt, because a man meets a woman for the first time only once, and whatever else was happening to him and around him and inside him, he was still his father's son, and Jacob Holt had not raised him to forget the basics of what a man owed another person. The Kerrville train station in July looked like every small Texas railroad stop looks under a summer sky that has lost all patience with shade. A low wooden platform under a narrow roof. Benches that had been painted once long ago in a color that had since reached an understanding with the sun and given up on its original ambition. A small station house with a window for the ticketing agent and a hand-lettered sign above the door that had been there so long the letters were more suggestion than instruction. Elias arrived 20 minutes early. He stood at the edge of the platform with his good hat in his hands rather than on his head, because he did not know the etiquette of hat wearing for an occasion like this one, and had decided that holding it was safer than getting it wrong. His clean white shirt was already showing the compromise a white shirt always reaches with a July afternoon in the Texas Hill Country, a compromise that favors the heat considerably. His pocket watch, the one his father had carried for 30 years and left to him, along with the land and the debt and the possibility, read 223. The train whistle sounded from the east low and long, and traveling through the thick summer air with the particular resonance that train whistles achieve in flat country, carrying farther than anything produced by a human throat has any reasonable right to carry. When the locomotive rolled into the station in a long exhalation of steam and slowing iron, 3 people stepped onto the platform. An older woman with a wicker basket heavy enough that she had to lean away from it to balance. A man in a 3-piece suit the color of deep water, carrying a hat that cost more than Elias had spent on clothing in the past 3 years combined. And her. Clara Bennett paused on the bottom step of the passenger car before she set foot on the platform. It was not hesitation. Elias understood that immediately, even from 40 feet away. It was observation. She stood on that bottom step, and she looked at the platform, at the station house, at the street beyond, at the hills in the middle distance, at Elias himself, with the systematic attention of someone reading a map before they commit to a route. Her eyes moved with purpose. She was cataloging something. He could not have said what, but he understood that she was not a woman who set foot in new places without first taking the measure of them. She was thinner than her photograph, which he had looked at so many times since receiving it in May, that the small card had developed a subtle softness at the corners from handling. Not unhealthy thin, the thinness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for an extended time and has not had the leisure to attend properly to eating. Her brown hair was pinned back neatly, but the heat of a long train journey had loosened several strands, which had found their way to her temples in the back of her neck. Her dress was calico simple and clean, travel wrinkled in the inevitable way of fabric that has spent too many hours against a train seat. She did not smile when she found him with her eyes. He did not smile either. They were two practical people meeting under circumstances that did not yet warrant smiling, and both of them seemed to understand this without discussion. Miss Bennett, Mr. Holt. Her voice carried the flat vowels of Ohio, nothing musical about it, nothing decorative. Underneath the straightforwardness, there was a quality he could not immediately name. Not sadness, something heavier than sadness and more controlled. It was the voice of a person who has been carrying something for long enough that the weight has become integrated into their ordinary way of moving through the world, not something they are currently struggling with, but something they have stopped distinguishing from themselves. He reached for her travel bag. The weight of it surprised him enough that he adjusted his grip before he caught himself. He had expected the weight of dresses, of the ordinary accumulation of what a woman brings when she travels far, to begin somewhere new. What he felt in his hand was something different, dense and organized. The weight of things packed with intention around other things being protected. He glanced at her. She was already looking past him toward the dirt road that led out of town, reading the landscape again, with the same systematic attention she had given the platform. He did not ask about the bag, she did not explain it. They walked to the wagon together without further conversation, and he helped her up, and they left the Kerrville station behind in the particular silence of two strangers who have agreed to something significant and are each quietly taking the full measure of what they have agreed to. The road west of town ran through country that did not apologize for what it was. Dry grass, the color of straw, stretched away on both sides toward hills made of limestone and cedar, and the particular stubbornness of Texas scrubland, which has learned to thrive under conditions that would discourage most vegetation with less ambition. The sky above it all was enormous. This was the thing about the hill country that no description quite captured for people who had not seen it. The sky was not merely large. It was a presence. It participated in the landscape in a way that skies in more sheltered country did not. Clara sat straight on the wagon seat without rigidity, the composure of a person who is naturally upright rather than one who is working at it. She looked at everything. The grass, the quality of the soil along the road's edge, the state of the fences, the color of the limestone outcroppings. She turned her head from side to side with the unhurried attention of someone conducting a quiet ongoing inventory. When they crossed the shallow creek that ran along the western edge of the Holt property, she straightened slightly. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Elias had been watching the road and watching her both, because a man who is about to share his life with a person he has never met pays attention to everything about that person in the first hour. She was looking upstream, not at the water itself, at the bank, at a specific place along the bank where the stones held a color that was different from the stone around them, a particular shade at the waterline that did not match the limestone it sat on. She looked at it for 4 or 5 seconds, her expression shifting into something focused and specific, and then the wagon rolled on and the creek disappeared behind them, and her expression returned to its general, careful attentiveness. He had seen it. He said nothing. She said nothing. They continued toward the ranch. The house came into view around the last bend before the property line, and Elias watched her see it for the first time, which told him things that the house itself could not have told him directly. The building was sound, his father had built well, and Elias had maintained carefully patching what needed patching, replacing what failed beyond repair. But maintenance is not the same as life, and the house showed the difference. It showed the way a well-maintained thing shows the absence of the person who once loved living in it. Clean enough, ordered enough, but without the small accumulations of ongoing habitation that signal a place where someone is actively choosing to be. Clara looked at the house, then at the stable beyond it, and then for just a moment at the air itself, as though she could read something in the atmosphere that the buildings were not directly saying. She could. He understood that later. Inside the house told its own story to anyone willing to read it, and she was very willing to read it. the dishes sitting in basin water that had gone cold. The calendar on the wall stopped at March. The shelf of books with the thin and even layer of dust that accumulates when volumes are not disturbed. The Bible with the faded spine at the end of the shelf, the most handled thing in the room and the most alone. And behind the kitchen door, a woman's dress in a shade of blue that had faded toward gray hanging on its nail, with the stillness of something that has waited a long time and is prepared to wait longer. Clara walked through each room slowly, not searching for anything specific, reading, the way a person reads something they have been handed by someone who could not find words for what they meant to say. She understood the shape of the life that had been lived here and the shape of the absence that had replaced it. She understood the man who had written her a two-sentence advertisement asking for practicality and modest expectations. When Elias said he would be in the stable and went out through the back door, she stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard. She watched the specific angle of his shoulders. When he walked away, they had taken on a forward curve that was not the posture of age, but the posture of sustained weight. She watched the stable door close behind him with the settled finality of a door that knows where its gravity lies. Night came down over the Texas hill country in gradations of amber and rose, and then a purple so deep it seemed to press the last light out of the sky by force. Elias did not come back to the house. Clara lit the oil lamp in the kitchen and ate what she found in the larder biscuits from 2 days ago, still wrapped in their cloth, slightly hard at the edges now because hardness was preferable to nothing, and she had learned not to be particular about the difference. She ate and watched the stable through the window. Even from this distance, even through glass that was lightly filmed with the dust that accumulates on every horizontal and vertical surface in the hill country, from approximately March through October, she could smell it. Not the ordinary smell of horses and hay and the productive living dirt of a working stable. That other smell, the wrong sweetness underneath. The chemical suggestion of something the body was doing to itself that it should not have been doing. She knew what that smell was. She had smelled it once before on a farm in Indiana where her father had been called in after the local veterinarian had given up, and her father had sat beside a sick calf through one long night, and by morning the calf was drinking. She had been 14 that year. She had sat beside her father and watched his hands and memorized the ratios he used and the sequence in which he added each ingredient to the preparation, and she had written it down afterward in the blank pages at the back of her grandmother's book, because knowledge that exists only in memory is knowledge that can be lost. She was not thinking about Indiana now. She was thinking about the stable 30 yards away and what she had seen in the creek bank that afternoon and the map that was beginning to assemble itself in her mind from the pieces she had been given. She washed her single dish and dried it and put it away. She turned down the lamp to its lowest setting. She went to her travel bag, which she had set in the small room off the kitchen that appeared to be intended for her, and she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and opened it. The dresses were on top, folded with the neatness of someone who has learned to make efficient use of limited space. Beneath them, the stockings and the small, personal items of daily living. And beneath all of that, wrapped individually in squares of soft flannel that she had cut from an old nightgown, specifically for this purpose, the 27 glass bottles. She unwrapped each one carefully and set it on the bed beside her. Willow bark, peppermint leaf, chamomile, yarrow root, white oak bark, ground ivy, horse mint, sweet flag. Each one labeled in her grandmother's handwriting, small and even and slightly forward-leaning, the penmanship of a woman who had written a great deal in the intervals between the physical work of her days. The ink on some of the older labels had faded to gray at the edges, but the words were still legible if you knew what you were looking for. Her grandmother had always known what she was looking for. Eleanor Bennett had come to Ohio from Pennsylvania in 1848, the year before Clara's father was born, carrying the knowledge of 3 generations of women who had tended to the sick when there was no one else to tend to them. Not doctors, nothing so formal or so credentialed. Women who knew plants and ratios and the specific ways that the body signals what it needs, who understood that healing is largely a matter of patience and observation, and the willingness to sit with something difficult until it resolves in one direction or the other. Eleanor had written it all down in a leather-covered book that was thinner than a Bible and worth considerably more, at least, to the families who had called her to their farms in the small hours of the night when an animal or a child had moved beyond what their usual resources could address. She had written remedies and ratios and seasonal notes, and the specific observations she had made across 60 years of watching things get sick, and watching things recover, and watching some things do neither. At the bottom of the travel bag wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a piece of kitchen string was that book. Clara unwrapped it. She opened it to the section she had found 2 weeks ago in Dayton after she had posted her acceptance letter and begun thinking seriously about what she might be walking into. She had opened it to the section marked with a red thread, and she had sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours reading every line. Chapter 7. Summer fever in horses and large livestock with notes on concurrent mineral toxicity in grazing animals, drinking from contaminated water sources. She had read it until her eyes burned, and then she had closed the book and sat for a long time with her hands in her lap, thinking about the advertisement she had answered the ranch in the Texas Hill Country, the water sources common to that country, and the specific quality of trouble that had been waiting for her without knowing she was coming. Now she read it again in the low lamplight, her lips moving slightly with the familiar habit of a person who learned to read aloud and never fully surrendered the practice even after silence became available to her. She read until the lamp needed filling and she filled it and read on. She read until she understood everything she needed to understand for the first step of what she intended to do. Then she put on her shawl, picked up the lamp, and went to the stable. The smell was heavier inside. The air was thick with it, the sweet, sour wrongness of sick horses in a closed space. And underneath that, the other note, the one that she had been building a theory around since she first caught it, standing at the wagon on the road home. Chemical, mineral, faint but persistent. She moved to the first stall and knelt beside the large gray horse lying there. She worked the way her grandmother had taught her to work systematically and without rushing, because rushing was how you missed the things that mattered. She checked the gums, pressing her finger gently against the tissue and observing the color and the capillary refill. Too pale. She checked the eyes, lifting the lid carefully and observing the clarity or lack of it. Dull. No responsive brightness when the light crossed the pupil. She checked the tongue, dry and carrying a slight yellowing at the center. She listened to the breathing pattern, counting the rate, noting the shallow irregularity of it. She pressed her palm flat against the barrel of the horse's rib cage and felt the wrong heat of a deep fever and the altered rhythm of the heartbeat underneath. She reached into the pocket of her shawl and took out the small glass vial and the piece of white cloth that she kept there the way her grandmother had always kept them. A few drops of the horse's urine on the cloth. She held it up to the lamplight and looked at the color of the stain it left. Yellow-green at the edges, not the clear yellow of ordinary output. The particular shade that her grandmother had written about in the margins of Chapter 7, the one she had seen once on a farm near Lancaster, encircled with a note beside it, copper exposure confirmed by creekside sampling, green precipitate on stones below the old mine. She knew what she was looking at. She stood and began moving to the next stall when the floorboard at the stable entrance gave its characteristic complaint under weight, and she stopped. Elias stood in the doorway with a lantern in his hand. The light from it came up into his face at an angle that emphasized the deep lines around his eyes. Lines that were not the markings of age, but of sustained tension, the kind that accumulates in a person over years of holding things together through the will rather than through any real possibility of relief. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a person who has been where they have every right to be and sees no reason to apologize for it. "You should not be in here," he said. "This horse has a fever." She kept her voice level, not defiant, simply factual, the way you state a thing that is true, regardless of what anyone in the vicinity might prefer. And it is not only a fever. There is something in the water source. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is choosing between several possible responses and is not certain which one he can afford. "Dr. Cole was here 3 days ago." "Yes," she said. "You told me," he said. He could not name it. She met his eyes. Then perhaps he did not look in the right places. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of possibility, and both of them could hear the difference. She waited a moment, and then, because she understood something about the particular kind of exhaustion she was looking at, she said, "I will tell you what I know in the morning, if you will hear it. Tonight I only want to look. Go inside, Miss Bennett." She nodded. She walked past him to the doorway, and as she passed, the lamplight caught something on the back of one of his hands that she had not noticed in the wagon or at dinner. The cracked knuckle, the split that had not been treated, dried dark at the edges. He had hit something in the past 24 hours with enough force to break the skin. She knew what that meant. She had seen the same mark on her father's hands more than once in the years before he died. She went inside. But she sat for a long time at the kitchen table in the dark after she put out the lamp, the travel bag at her feet, and the stable visible through the window as a dark shape against the darker sky. She sat and she thought about the creek bank and the color she had seen on the stone at the waterline, that particular blue-green that she recognized from her grandmother's careful notes. The oxidized copper that accumulates below abandoned mines when heavy rains push the minerals through the rock and into the water table. She thought about the horses and what she had read in Chapter 7 about the interaction between copper toxicity and summer fever, how each one alone was manageable, but together they created a condition the body could not negotiate. She thought about her father, about the 3 farm families north of Dayton who had lost their hog operations in the summer of 1885 because the local veterinarian had declared the illness unidentifiable, and her father had known exactly what it was and had said so clearly to anyone who would listen, and the people who were in a position to make the decision had chosen to defer to the man with the credential. Her father had watched those hogs die over 8 days, and she had watched what that watching did to him, the progressive dimming of something that she had always thought of as essential to him, the conviction that what he knew had value. That knowledge passed down through generations of careful observation was a real thing and not a superstition to be set aside when a man with a framed certificate said otherwise. He had not recovered from it. That was the truth of it, plain and unadorned. He had not recovered from being right and being ignored, and then having to stand at the edge of what the ignoring had cost, while the people who had ignored him quietly moved on to other concerns. He had not died of illness. He had died of the particular kind of defeat that comes to people who know how to help and are prevented from doing so. She had left Dayton because she could not find her own life in the spaces between his absence and her mother's grief, and the town that had moved on without particularly noticing the shape of what it had lost. She had answered Elias Holt's advertisement because it offered the 2 things she needed: distance and purpose, a place where she could put what she carried to use. She had not known about the horses. She had not known about any of this. But sitting in the dark kitchen of the Holt Ranch with the stable visible through the window and the smell of illness moving faintly through the night air toward her, she understood something she had not quite articulated to herself until this moment. She had not come too late. She had come at exactly the right time, which sometimes looks the same as coming too late until you are far enough through it to see the difference. She reached into the bag and took out the glass vial she had used in the stable. She held it up toward the faint light from the window and looked at the dried edge of the stain on the cloth still wrapped around it. Green-yellow. The oxidized copper signature her grandmother had described and that she had read enough times to recognize without uncertainty. She wrote a single line on the scrap of paper she kept in her dress pocket for the purpose of writing things down before she had time to forget them. Copper from the upstream mine. Seasonal fever on top of it. Begin with the water source. Begin tomorrow. She folded the paper and put it away. Then she sat in the dark for a long time thinking about the creek bank and the abandoned Black Rock copper mine 5 miles upstream, and the way the land told the truth about itself if you knew where to look for the telling and what was going to have to happen now, whether the man in the stable was ready to hear it or not. Outside, the Texas hill country settled into the deep quiet of a summer night. Crickets in the grass, a mockingbird somewhere west of the fence line running through its catalog of borrowed songs, the occasional shift and sigh of horses in the stable, the sound of animals suffering in the dark without understanding why. Clara Bennett sat in the kitchen of a house that did not know her yet, in a county that would not know her name until she gave it a reason to, and she made her decision. She would begin in the morning, whether anyone asked her to or not. Clara was awake before 4 in the morning. She had slept in the intervals between thinking, which is not the same as sleeping, but is sometimes the most that a person can manage on the first night in an unfamiliar place with a problem pressing against the inside of her skull. She lay still for a while after the last interval of sleep had passed, listening to the sounds of the ranch in the early dark. Wind through the cedar breaks to the north. Something small moving in the grass near the house. And from the stable, just audible if she was quiet enough, herself to hear it, the slow and labored breathing of horses that were working too hard at the simple act of staying alive. She got up. The stove was cold, the ash from 2 days prior still sitting in the firebox because grief and exhaustion and the kind of focused dread that had been living in this house for weeks did not leave much energy for the ordinary maintenance of warmth. She cleaned the ash and built a new fire with the care of someone who has learned that the first fire in a cold stove requires patience rather than hurry. She found oats and a good jar of honey in the larder salt and a stub of butter. She brewed coffee with the full amount of grounds, none of the economies of a household that has stopped expecting to enjoy the morning. She did not do any of this for effect. She did it because her grandmother had told her long ago that the way a person begins the way shapes the day they get, and she intended to get a productive one. She had the oatmeal ready and the coffee poured and was sitting at the table reading chapter 7 again when Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had slept in his clothes or he had not slept at all. The same flannel shirt from the night before, the collar still open, the cuffs rolled to the forearm. His eyes carried the particular redness that comes not from weeping, but from hours of open-eyed darkness, the redness of someone who has been staring at the underside of the night and finding nothing useful there. The split knuckle on his right hand had darkened overnight. He had not cleaned or wrapped it. He looked at the 2 bowls and the 2 cups on the table and said nothing for a moment. "You did not have to do that. I was hungry," Clara said without looking up from the book. She turned a page. Her grandmother's handwriting moved across the paper in its small, confident lines. She had read this section enough times by now that she was not reading for content. She was reading to be certain she had not missed anything. Elias sat down. He picked up the coffee cup and drank from it, and whatever expression crossed his face when the coffee was better than anything he had made for himself in months, he kept it brief and did not comment on it. He ate a few spoonfuls of the oatmeal. The kitchen held the particular quality of silence that belongs to two people eating together when they are not yet certain what they are to each other. "My grandmother used to say the house wakes up faster when the kitchen is warm," Clara said. She closed the book. He looked at her, not unkindly, with the careful attention of a man who is measuring something. She looked back at him with the same steadiness she had offered the night before in the stable, the level, unapologetic gaze of a person who has decided what she knows and does not need external confirmation to maintain her confidence in it. She had her grandmother's eyes, people had told her sometimes, though she had never been sure what that meant beyond the color. Her grandmother had looked at things with a quality of attention that made people feel simultaneously understood and examined. "I want to tell you what I found last night," she said. He put down the spoon. He did not cross his arms or set his jaw or do any of the things a man does when he has decided to resist before the speaking has started. He simply sat and waited, which was something. "The horses are sick with 2 things at once," she said. "Summer fever, which is seasonal and manageable on its own, and copper poisoning from the water source which has been accumulating in their system since spring. The two together have overwhelmed what would otherwise be adequate defenses." Cole said he could not name it. She let that statement sit for a moment without pushing it aside. He said what he said. "I am telling you what I found when I looked. Pennsylvania is not Texas," he said. The words came out flat, not heated, but with a finality to them that she recognized. It was the finality of a man who had said something similar to himself many times in the past 2 weeks and had not yet found a satisfying reply. "No," she said. "But copper behaves the same way in water, regardless of what state the water is flowing through. And summer fever in horses does not become a different illness because the summer is in Texas rather than Pennsylvania." She paused. "There is an abandoned copper mine 5 miles upstream on that creek. I saw the oxidation on the bankstones yesterday when we crossed. Heavy spring rains have been pushing copper compounds through the rock and into the water since March. Your horses have been drinking from that source." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him absorb this. She could see the 2 things happening simultaneously in him, the part that wanted to believe because belief meant possibility, and the part that had spent 3 weeks being told there was no possibility and had learned to protect itself against the cost of hoping. Cole looked at that water, he said. Did he take samples from the bank stones above the waterline? A longer pause. I do not know what he looked at. Then perhaps he did not look at everything she said. This is not a criticism of a man I have not met. It is an observation about where the evidence is. She straightened in her chair. I need to move the horses off the creek water today. The old well on the east side, is there still water in it? He looked at her. Some. Enough for now. Then that is where we start. She stood and began clearing the bowls. And I need to begin the first preparation this morning. Willow bark and peppermint for the fever. There is yarrow near the south pasture fence. I can see it from the window. It will take time. I want to start today. He was on his feet before she finished. The speed of it surprised her. Not the movement itself, but the quality of it, less like a man deciding to stand, and more like a man whose body had been waiting for something to move toward. Then he stopped. He stood in the kitchen with his hands at his sides, and something in his face shifted into an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was made of similar materials. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected. Dr. Cole told me there was nothing to be done. He pulled his chair back. That doctor has been the only one available to this county for 23 years. And you arrived on the afternoon train yesterday carrying a bag full of bottles and a book from your grandmother. Yes, she said. That is accurate. The chair went back against the floor with a sound that was not quite a shove. He turned toward the back door. I do not need advice from someone who got here yesterday. She watched him go. The screen door settled into its frame behind him with the tired finality of something that has been opened and closed too many times. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she washed both bowls and both cups, dried them, set them where she had found them. Her hands were steady. They shook only once very slightly when she set the last cup down and heard nothing from outside except the scrape of his boot against the porch step and then silence. She had heard that voice before, not his voice specifically, the voice of a man so thoroughly alone in a problem that the arrival of help reads as one more thing to be suspicious of. Her father had sat across from that voice more than once in the last years of his life and had come home from those meetings a little smaller, each time a little less certain that what he knew was worth the trouble of knowing. She was not going to become smaller. She went out the back door with her collecting bag over her arm, and she walked to the creek. The morning air still held a trace of the night's relative coolness, the brief concession the Texas summer makes to the dark before taking it back with interest after sunrise. She walked the fence line toward the creek crossing, moving at the pace of a person who is paying attention to the ground beneath her feet and the plants growing along the margins of the path, reading the landscape as she moved through it. At the creek, she worked methodically. She collected samples of the bank's sediment from 3 locations using the small glass jars she had packed for exactly this purpose. She collected water from the same 3 locations. She scraped the blue-green oxidized material from the surface of the rocks at the waterline and examined it in the morning light, holding it close and then farther away. She had brought a piece of white cloth and she pressed a sample of the sediment against it, observing the transfer of color. The characteristic shade was unmistakable to anyone who had read what she had read and then gone looking for it in the physical world. She stood at the creek bank in the early morning light with the evidence of what she already knew laid out in front of her and felt the particular satisfaction of a theory confirmed by the actual substance of the world. Her father had felt this. She had seen it on his face on the mornings when an animal had recovered overnight the way he had predicted it would, the quiet internal pleasure of having understood something correctly. When she walked back toward the house, Elias was working at the fence on the south side of the property. She went to him directly. She did not build toward it with preliminary conversation. The creek water is contaminated, she said. I took samples from 3 points. The oxidized copper is present at all 3. I want to show you. He set down the fence tool he had been using and looked at her. She held out the piece of white cloth with the stain on it. She told him what the color meant, and she told him about the rainfall and the mine and the chemistry of copper in moving water. And she told him what her grandmother had written about the interaction between copper accumulation and summer fever, and why the combination was more dangerous than either condition alone. He listened. He did not agree, not yet, not out loud, but he listened in the way of a man who is hearing something that is rearranging certain items in a mental room he had thought was organized. Can you move the horses to the east well today? She asked. He looked out at the pasture for a moment. Then, the well is low. I would need to pump more before evening. I will help with that, but they need off the creek water today. Every day they continue drinking from it undoes some of what the treatment can accomplish. A silence. not the silence of refusal, the silence of a man recalculating. He nodded once slowly. That was enough. She went back to the house and began the first preparation. She had set up her working space on the kitchen table, which she had cleared and covered with a piece of oilcloth from the bottom of her bag. The glass bottles were lined up according to use. The small copper pot she had asked permission to use sat on the stove with water from the east well already heating. She measured the willow bark by the ratio written in her grandmother's hand on the inside cover of Chapter 7, added the peppermint at the secondary stage, the way Eleanor Bennett had described it, and stirred with the wooden spoon she had found hanging near the stove, and immediately claimed for the purpose. The smell that rose from the pot was sharp and clean in the way of things that work. Medicinal, purposeful. It filled the kitchen and moved through the house the way a different kind of presence moves through a place that has been without it for too long. She made 3 batches through the morning. She did not see Elias until early afternoon when she went to the stable with the first pitcher of the warm preparation and found him working in the paddock with the fence around the east well, extending the enclosure to bring the horses to a clean water source. He had not asked her about this. He had simply done it, which was something she was beginning to understand about him when a decision reached him. As correct, he moved toward it without announcement. She was halfway through the 3rd stall when the sound came from the far end of the stable. High, sharp, cut short before its full length. A sound that travels through the nervous system of anyone who has spent time around horses as an alarm that bypasses rational thought and goes directly to the feet. She was running before she had decided to run. Elias was already there. Bella was lying in the 5th stall. She was 3 years old, the youngest animal in the herd, the one Elias had assisted into the world on a rainy night at the beginning of her life, when her mother had needed help, and he had stayed through the long hours until the foal stood on its uncertain first legs in the lamplight. He had named her Bella. Clara had heard the name when he listed the herd for her that morning, and she had heard something in the way he said it that she had not asked about yet. She understood it now, seeing the way he had dropped to his knees beside the horse, both hands pressed flat against the animal's neck, as though physical pressure could hold the life in. Bella's legs moved once weakly, and then her chest rose in 2 small successive movements, and then it did not rise again. Elias bowed his head. He did not make a sound. He knelt in the straw with his hands still on the horse's neck, and his head down and his shoulders moved slightly once with the specific shaking of a man who has trained himself not to make sounds when grief finds him and is paying the cost of that training with the rest of his body instead. Clara stood at the stall door. Her grandmother had taught her something about this kind of moment. Some grief cannot be touched by another person, and the attempt to touch it causes harm rather than comfort. She did not move. She did not speak. She stood at the door and she bore witness, which was the only useful thing available to her. After a time that was longer than it might have seemed from the outside, Elias lifted his head. His face had been rearranged by the last few minutes into something harder and more settled, the expression of a person who has absorbed a loss and decided where to carry it. He looked at Clara. The particular quality of what passed between them in that moment was not blame and was not accusation, but was something more complicated than either the look of a man confronting the gap between what has been done and what might have been done, and knowing that the gap contains things that cannot be recovered. Begin the treatment on the others, he said. His voice was flat in the way of someone who has flattened it deliberately. Whatever you need, tell me. She nodded. She would tell him, but first she watched him get to his feet and go to the tack room for the shovel he would need, and she watched him walk out through the stable door into the flat afternoon heat to go find the right place in the east field, and she thought about her father again. About the specific weight of being right and being too late at the same time. She went back to work. Chester Boone arrived the following morning on a gray horse that moved with the patient dignity of an animal that had long ago decided the world was worth observing at a measured pace. He was 68 years old, white-haired, with a beard he still groomed, because certain habits are too structural to abandon the habits that remind a man of who he decided to be. He dismounted at the gate with the deliberate care of a person who knows their joints and respects the information they provide. Elias was in the stable. Chester walked in without knocking, which was the prerogative of a man who had known this stable longer than its current owner had been alive. Heard about Bella, Chester said. Buried her yesterday afternoon. Chester stood for a moment, looking at the animals in the stalls, at the ones who were still on their feet and the ones who were not, and his face carried the expression of someone tallying a loss they had been hoping to avoid hearing confirmed. He took his hat off and held it. It was the gesture of a man in the presence of something that deserved acknowledgement. He said nothing for a while. He turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the horses without appearing to look at any one of them specifically. "There is something I have been meaning to say," he said at last. "Something I should have said a good while before now." Elias set down what he was holding and looked at him. The Richardson place. Chester did not look up from the hat. 4 years ago, you remember hearing about it? Lost the whole beef herd in a week. That is right. Chester turned the hat once more. Cole was the one they called in. He came out, looked things over, said he could not make a diagnosis. Shook his head and rode away. Same as he did here. Elias waited. About a month before the Richardson cattle started going down, Cole had been out there for a regular visit. Routine treatment for a respiratory thing that had been moving through herds in the north of the county that spring. I was at the Richardson fence line the following week settling a boundary question with old man Richardson, and I saw the empty bottles in the rubbish pile. I took note of the name on the label because it was one I had not seen before, and I was curious. I have a good memory for that kind of thing. Chester paused. He looked up now and looked directly at Elias with the eyes of a man delivering something he has carried for long enough that the carrying has changed his posture. I saw the same label in Cole's bag when he was here 3 days ago. Same medication. I saw him take it out and put it back when he was going through his kit. The stable was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted in a stall further down. Outside, a wood thrush was working through its song in the cedar brakes. Elias said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Why are you telling me this now?" Chester looked down at the hat again. "Because I was not certain enough before to say it out loud. Because Cole has been the only veterinarian this county has known for 23 years, and saying something like this about a man like that without certainty is not a thing you do lightly." Chester stopped. "Because the woman you brought back on the afternoon train has been out in this stable every night treating these horses with what she knows, and 3 of the ones that were lying flat are showing improvement this morning. And I thought that with that happening, my uncertainty was less important than your needing to know what I know." Elias held the information for a moment the way you hold something that is going to require rearranging other things to accommodate. He looked out through the open stable door at the yard at the house at the line of the hills beyond. "You think he knew," Elias said. "When he stood in this stable 3 days ago and shook his head, you think he had seen it before?" I think Chester said carefully that there is a difference between not knowing and not saying, and I think it is possible that Dr. Cole has spent 4 years acquainting himself with the difference. Elias was quiet for a long time. He stared at the empty stall where Bella had been lying. The straw was still disturbed, there pushed into the particular arrangement of something that had lain in it for a long time and then was gone. "Tell me," he said finally, "what you want to do about it." Chester put his hat back on. "Nothing yet. What I want to do is make sure that what she is doing works. Because if it works, then we have something more than my memory of a label on a bottle. Then we have proof that a different approach was possible." Elias nodded. Chester left the way he had come on his patient gray horse at the same measured pace. Elias stood in the stable for a few minutes after he was gone, in the particular quality of stillness that comes to a person who has just received information that reorganizes the meaning of things they thought they already understood. Then he went to find Clara. She was behind the house at the outdoor fire pit she had asked to use for the larger preparations, tending a pot that smelled of bark and sharp green things. She was stirring with the long wooden spoon and had a smear of something dark on the back of her left wrist, where she had wiped her hand without thinking. She looked up when he approached. He told her about Chester, about the labels and the Richardson herd and the 4 years of silence. He told her without editorializing, presenting the information in the flat, sequential way of a man relaying facts and trusting the listener to draw their own conclusions. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, still stirring, looking at the pot. "That would explain the rate of progression," she said. "The copper accumulation alone would have made them more susceptible than normal. But if the prophylactic treatment further compromised the immune response at the same time, then what they were fighting was considerably worse than either condition on its own. And Cole knew this." She looked up at him. "Whether he knew it at the time he gave the treatment, perhaps not. But I think he has had 4 years to work out what the possibilities were. And I think standing in this stable 3 days ago, he recognized what he was looking at. Elias let this settle into the space of the morning without responding to it directly. He looked at the pot. The smell of the preparation moved on the warm air between them. "What do you need this afternoon?" he said. "More yarrow. And I want to check on the 3 horses in the middle stalls again before the afternoon heat sets in." He stood without moving for a moment. "Then I know where the yarrow grows on the south hill. I can take you there." She studied him. Something in his expression had changed from the day before, not softened exactly, but shifted. The angle of his resistance was different. Not gone, but differently oriented. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They went together in the late morning, walking the slope south of the main pasture, where the rocky limestone ground broke through the soil in shelves and ledges, and the plants that preferred such exposure grew in small, concentrated communities between the outcroppings. He showed her the yarrow in a long depression below the third shelf of rock, growing in the way yarrow grows when it is happy, in dense flat-top clusters that caught the sunlight and turned it into something useful. She showed him how to cut the stems correctly high enough above the base growth to take the medicinal portion without damaging the plant's capacity to continue. She showed him how to assess which clusters were at peak potency by the color of the florets and the condition of the lower leaves. He watched her work with the attention of a man who respects a practical skill and is paying it the full courtesy of his observation. When she handed him a short stem to examine, he rubbed the leaves between his fingers and held them to his nose the way she indicated. He made a face at the intensity of the smell, a quick, involuntary expression, and she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since leaving Dayton. The sound came out before she had decided to let it, and it surprised both of them. She heard it as though from a small distance, the laugh of a person who had forgotten that this was something she could still do. He looked at her, not smiling, but something in his face that was in the vicinity of warmth, something that had been in that vicinity before, but had not quite arrived. They walked back down the slope more slowly than they had walked up. That evening, they worked together in the stable, moving down the row of stalls with the systematic rhythm that was developing between them as a working unit, not yet comfortable exactly, but increasingly functional, each understanding without discussion where the other one needed to be and adjusting accordingly. He hauled the water. She prepared and administered. He held the animals still when they needed holding and released them when the tension passed. It was in the 7th stall that he stopped. Cooper was standing. The chestnut gelding had been on the ground for 8 days. He was 7 years old, one of the strongest animals in the string before the illness came on, and he had gone down as fast as the older horses, which had told Clara something about how advanced the copper accumulation was. He stood now with his legs slightly spread, his head low, his whole bearing the careful uprightnesses of a body that is not yet certain it can trust its own engineering. But he was standing, his feet were on the ground, and his legs were holding him, and his eyes, when Elias stepped into the stall, turned toward the sound of his entry. Elias put his hand on the horse's neck. Not the burning heat of deep fever, not the alarming dryness of a coat losing moisture to illness faster than the body could replace it. Warm, normally warm, the warmth of a living animal on a summer evening. He stood with his hand on Cooper's neck for a long time. He did not speak. He did not turn around. His back was to Clara, who stood at the stall door, and she watched the set of his shoulders and waited. When he finally turned, his face was not wet. He had not cried, which she had not expected him to do, but something had moved through him, something large and quiet that had left a different stillness in its wake. She recognized the expression. She had seen it on her father's face on the mornings when something that had been going wrong the night before had found its way back toward right, the expression of a man who has let himself believe again, carefully and with reservation, but genuinely. "How many more days?" he said. 8 to 10 for most of them, she said. "Drummer needs more time." "What does Drummer need more time for?" She looked at the old horse in the first stall, visible from where they stood lying still in the early evening light, with the stubborn, labored regularity of his breathing marking his persistence. "He needs someone patient," she said. He looked at her, the word patient settling in the space between them. "I will stay in the stable tonight. So will I." He did not argue. It was on the 7th night that the storm came. It announced itself the way Texas storms announce themselves, through the physics of the air, rather than through any visible sign, a drop in pressure that a person who has lived long enough in open country learns to feel as a physical fact in the chest and the ears before the sky has changed enough to explain it visually. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind had shifted from the prevailing southwest to something more westerly, colder and harder, and the clouds that appeared on the horizon to the northwest had the specific architectural quality of clouds that are carrying a great deal of water, a great distance, and have not yet begun to share it. Elias looked at the sky for 30 seconds. "Get everything you need from the house," he said. She was already moving. They were in the stable when the storm reached them. The wind hit the building like a physical presence throwing itself against the walls to find a weakness, and the horses, all of them, the sick and the recovering, and the few who were well enough to know what was happening, responded with the deep biological alarm that horses have felt about storms since before the first one was ever put in a stable. Their eyes went wide, the whites showing. Their nostrils flared. They moved in the stalls with the restless, contained panic of animals whose instinct says run and whose walls say stay. Elias and Clara worked together to secure what could be secured, to speak calmly to what could be calmed, to brace what needed bracing. They pushed the stable doors shut against the wind, using the combined weight of both of them, leaning hard into the wood, while the storm leaned back and the doors closed with a reluctant shudder and latched. Then the roof failed. The section above the first stall had been on Elias's mental list of things to address since March, a stretch of aging boards where the roofing nails had begun to lose their purchase in wood that had been expanding and contracting through too many seasons. The wind found it the way wind finds every weakness, not because it was looking specifically, but because weakness is always where wind ends up. There was a sound like a gunshot above them, and then a tearing, and then the roaring entrance of the storm through a gap in the ceiling that opened over Drummer's stall like something had simply decided to reach down and remove the barrier. Rain came through, not gently, in the way that rain comes through an opening in a Texas storm, which is the way very cold water comes through a hole in the ceiling that is directly above a very sick horse. Drummer seized. It happened in the way that cold shock happens to a compromised body that has been fighting fever for 2 weeks and has nothing left in reserve against a sudden reversal of temperature. The horse's muscles locked in a single convulsive movement. His back arched, his legs extended, and struck at nothing. His whole body became rigid with the terrible electrical intensity of a system overloading. Elias reached him first. He went down onto his knees in the wet straw with the rain coming through the gap in the ceiling above them, soaking through his shirt and into his hair, and he pressed his hands against the horse's neck, and his face came down close to the horse's face, and he said no. Not a plea, not a command, the simple flat refusal of a man who has lost enough and is no longer negotiating with the possibility of losing more. "Drummer, no." His voice broke on the second word, not loudly. A small fracture in a voice that had been holding its controlled, deliberate flatness through 3 weeks of dying and loss in the particular discipline of a man who has decided that whatever he feels will be expressed through labor rather than sound. The fracture was small. It lasted only the length of that one word. But in the silence that followed it, standing in the rain coming through a broken roof in her first storm in Texas, Clara understood something about Elias Holt that she had not yet understood. This was not a man who had stopped feeling things. This was a man who had been feeling everything and paying the full price of that in silence, and the price had finally exceeded what the silence could absorb. She did not go to him. She went to the horse. She crouched on the other side of Drummer's head and put 2 fingers beneath the jaw, searching. The rain was in her eyes and running down the back of her neck and soaking through the fabric of her dress, where she was kneeling in the wet straw, and she ignored all of it because the only thing that mattered in this moment was the information available through her fingertips. There, faint, the specific pulse of a heart that has not stopped present beneath her fingers like a thread in the dark. "Elias," she said. Her voice was steady. It cost something to keep it steady, but she kept it. "He is alive. I can feel his pulse. But I need your help." He lifted his head, raining something else on his face. He looked at her across the horse's body with the expression of a man who has just returned from a place he had not intended to go and is not entirely certain of the geography between there and here. "Tell me what to do," he said. Those 5 words, Clara understood, were not small. They were the words of a man who does not easily ask for direction, reversing the direction of his asking. We need to get him out of the water and out of the cold. She was already moving, taking the rope from the hook on the stall post. We need to warm him slowly, not fast. And we need to keep dosing him through the night every 15 minutes. The preparation on the kitchen stove there is a full pot, bring a bucket, and the small ladle, the tin one, on the third hook. Can you pull on this rope when I tell you yes? Then pull. They work through the storm in the specific wordless efficiency of two people who have stopped being careful with each other and are simply doing what needs doing. They moved Drummer out of the flooding stall to the dry center aisle. They brought the small iron stove from the tack room and lit it with wood that Elias found stacked dry in the far corner, because he was a man who stacked wood dry, even in the sections of the stable he rarely used, because Jacob Holt had taught him that preparedness was not a virtue you practiced selectively. They wrapped the horse in every blanket available, 3 from the tack room and the 2 from the house that Clara went to retrieve through the storm between doses. Every 15 minutes. She knelt beside the horse and administered the preparation with the small tin ladle, a careful trickle at the corner of the mouth, waiting for the swallow reflex that sometimes came and sometimes did not. Elias held the horse's head at the angle she indicated, his large hands steady and precise, following her directions without modification or comment. Around midnight, Drummer stopped responding to the medication. The swallow reflex that had been present weekly but consistently for the first 3 hours of the night disappeared. She administered, waited, administered again. Nothing moved in the horse's throat. She sat back on her heels. The storm had slowed to a steady rain outside the wind, having spent most of its fury and settled into the longer, quieter work of soaking everything that remained. The fire in the small iron stove held its circle of warmth against the larger cold. "There is one more thing I can try," she said. She said it quietly, not to Elias specifically, more to the problem in front of her, working through it aloud. He looked at her from across the horse's body. "My grandmother believed that sound could reach a nervous system that had closed against other input. She used it as a last resort when medication failed. She said the body sometimes responds to a familiar pattern when it will not respond to a chemical one." She did not wait for a response. She put her hand on Drummer's jaw, feeling the faint warmth of the horse's breath against her wrist, and she began to sing. It was her grandmother's song, an Irish melody that Eleanor Bennett had learned from her own mother, who had brought it from County Mayo to Pennsylvania in 1819, along with the willowbark knowledge and the chamomile knowledge, and the specific way of watching sick things that had traveled through the women of the family, like a river traveling underground, invisible most of the time but present and purposeful. The melody was not complicated. It did not need to be. It moved in the patterns that old music moves, in patterns old enough to predate the specific architectures of individual grief and reach something more basic underneath. Her voice was not beautiful in the way of a trained singer. It was the voice of a woman singing something she knew in her bones, which is a different kind of beauty entirely. It moved through the wet, firelit air of the Texas stable with a quality that did not belong to July or to this particular latitude, but to something older and more persistent. Drummer's ear moved, the left ear a small rotation toward the sound. She kept singing. She poured a careful trickle of the preparation into the corner of his mouth. His throat moved. He swallowed. She did not stop. She poured again, sang the same phrase again, and waited. And he swallowed again, and she felt through her fingertips against his jaw the slight change in the quality of his pulse, something fractionally stronger than it had been. She was aware, without turning to look, that Elias had gone still. She was aware a few moments later that he was watching her. She did not know when he had moved from his position across the horse to the edge of the stall door, but he was there. She could feel the specific quality of his attention, the way you feel the heat from a fire without looking at it. She kept singing. She administered. She waited. She administered again. The storm moved east through the remainder of the night, trailing behind it the specific silence of a landscape that has been thoroughly washed. The fire in the small iron stove burned steadily. The rain that had come through the broken section of the roof settled into a drip at the edge of Drummer's old stall, regular and gradually slowing. Sometime before 4 in the morning, Clara finished the song for what must have been the 15th time and did not begin it again. The stable was quiet around them. Drummer's breathing had changed, still slow, still careful. but regular now in a way it had not been before midnight, and the quality of his stillness had shifted from the stillness of a body failing to the stillness of a body resting. She sat with her hand on his jaw in the firelight, and the slowly lifting dark, and she did not speak, and neither did Elias, because they had passed through something together that had no immediate use for words. Outside, the first birds were beginning. The sky through the gap in the broken roof was the specific gray that precedes dawn. Not the gray of night persisting, but the gray of light arriving at its earliest possible expression, the color of something that has decided to return. The dawn came in the way that dawn comes after a Texas storm has passed through and finished its business. Not gently, not with the gradual apologetic lightning of an ordinary morning. It came with the specific clarity that belongs only to a sky that has been completely emptied and washed and hung back up, a transparency so complete that the first light through it seemed to have traveled a greater distance than usual and arrived with more information than light ordinarily carries. The hills to the east caught it first, the limestone outcroppings going from gray to pale gold in the space of 10 minutes, and then the cedar breaks, and then the flat pasture land, and then the yard of the Holt Ranch with its repaired fences and its new well housing and its stable with the broken section of roof open to the brightening sky, like a wound beginning to consider the possibility of closing. Elias and Clara sat at the entrance to the stable as the light came up. Both of them were damp from the night, their clothes carrying the particular stiffness of fabric that has been wet and is only partway through the process of deciding to be dry again. Both of them were carrying the specific exhaustion of a night spent in sustained purposeful effort, which is a different exhaustion from the kind that comes from ordinary labor. It sits differently in the body. It leaves a person quiet in a way that is not empty, but settled. Drummer was sleeping. Not the shallow, effortful half-consciousness of the past 2 weeks, the thin sleep of a body using all available resources just to maintain the argument for its own continuation. He was sleeping with the full weight of a large animal that has decided to rest, his breathing slow, and even the wet rattle that had been present for days completely gone. The blankets rose and fell in a regular rhythm. His ears, which had been pressed flat for so long that Clara had begun to catalog their position as a baseline indicator of his condition, were relaxed now, tilted slightly to the side in the unconscious manner of a horse that is not on guard. They had been watching him sleep for about an hour, since just before 3 in the morning, when the quality of his breathing had shifted, and both of them had recognized the shift without discussion, the way two people who have been paying attention to the same thing for long enough develop a shared language for its changes. Neither of them had moved from the stable entrance. The fire in the small iron stove had burned down to a low, steady warmth. The smell of the preparation still hung in the air, medicinal and sharp and purposeful, mixed now with the smell of wet straw and the specific freshness that enters any enclosed space after a storm has moved through the gaps in its walls. Through the broken section of the roof above Drummer's old stall, which they had moved him away from during the night, a square of early sky was visible, going from charcoal to deep blue to the first suggestion of something warmer. Elias was looking at the square of sky when Drummer opened his eyes. It was not a dramatic awakening. The horse did not lift his head or attempt to rise. He simply opened his eyes in the unhurried way of an animal returning from deep sleep, and his gaze moved through the space around him with the slow reorienting attention of a creature locating itself in the world after an absence. The brown eyes moved across the stable, across the embers of the stove, across the light coming through the roof gap, and then they found Elias. The horse looked at him. Elias had been looking at something else when it happened, and then he was looking at Drummer, the way the eye moves towards something without being directed, following a change in the field of attention that it registers before the mind is caught up. He went very still. He looked at the horse looking at him, and he understood what he was seeing, not because he needed to analyze it, but because he had known this horse for 18 years, and he knew this look the way he knew his own reflection, the specific recognition in those brown eyes that said, "You. Here, I know you." He reached out and placed his hand flat against Drummer's muzzle. The horse pressed back very gently. Less pressure than the greeting he gave every morning, less force than the familiar nudge against the shoulder, but the same intention behind it. The same directed, deliberate acknowledgement that had been the first thing Elias noticed every morning for 18 years before the illness came and took it away. He kept his hand where it was. He did not speak. The muscles of his jaw were doing a specific kind of work that is distinct from either speaking or eating, the work of holding an expression still that would otherwise change into something uncontrolled. Then, without looking towards her, without deciding to do it in the conscious way of decisions that are made, he reached his other hand sideways and placed it over Clara's hand where it rested on her knee. She did not move. She did not pull away or shift her weight or do any of the things that would have broken the moment by making it into a larger thing than it needed to be. She turned her hand over beneath his quietly, the way you turn towards something without making an announcement of the turning, and her fingers found his and stayed there. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the first birds were fully awake now, and the light was gold and honest and moving steadily across the land. In the 2 weeks that followed the storm, the Holt Ranch changed. It changed the way things change when they have been near the edge of not changing at all and have pulled back from that edge, not through luck, but through the specific combination of knowledge and willingness and sustained labor. The change was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It accumulated in small increments that were each individually modest and collectively significant. 12 of the 13 surviving horses were on their feet by the end of the first week after the storm. Not all of them with equal confidence. Some were still finding their legs, still operating with the careful testing quality of bodies relearning a basic competence. But they were standing, and standing meant eating, and eating meant the ark had bent back toward the direction it needed to go. Cooper moved through the paddock with increasing assurance, his chestnut coat beginning to recover its depth of color as the fever retreated and his system began the work of restoring what the illness had cost. He was the first one out in the mornings, which was his nature, and seeing him at the fence in the early light was something that Elias noticed every day, with the specific quality of attention you give to things that have been nearly taken from you. Drummer walked on the 9th day after the storm, slowly and with Elias's hand on his halter for the first 20 minutes, because the horse had not been fully on his feet in 3 weeks, and because Elias was not a man who trusted recovery before it had demonstrated itself adequately. But he walked, and his stride was deliberate, and when he reached the gate of the paddock, he stopped and looked at the open pasture beyond it, the way a very old person looks at a familiar landscape they have not been certain of seeing again. Elias stood beside him and looked at the same pasture. Clara watched from the fence and did not interrupt. Mabel Stone arrived on a Wednesday morning 11 days after the storm, driving her wagon with a sick dairy cow roped to the back. She was 56 years old and practical in the way of women who have run a property alone for long enough that practicality has become not a strategy, but a defining characteristic. She had heard about the Holt horses from Chester Boone, who had mentioned it to Aldrich at the feed store, who had mentioned it to the Henderson boy, who had told his mother, who had told Mabel Stone directly on Sunday after church. Mabel Stone did not believe things she had been told. She believed things she could verify. She pulled up at the Holt gate and looked at the paddock where Cooper and 2 other horses were moving in the early morning light, and then she looked at Clara, who was coming out of the stable with a bucket and the expression of someone in the middle of working, and she conducted her assessment in approximately 15 seconds. "My cow is not giving milk," Mabel said. "3 weeks. Doc Cole told me she was too old. He told me to sell her." Clara set down the bucket. She walked to the back of the wagon and looked at the cow without hurry. She checked the animal the way she checked every animal, systematically, and from the beginning, not assuming anything, because an assumption is what you make when you have stopped looking. She told Mabel what she found. She told her what she intended to use. She told her it would take time and that there were no guarantees, because her grandmother had taught her that honest uncertainty was more useful to a person than false confidence. Mabel listened. She nodded once, which was the Mabel Stone equivalent of extended and enthusiastic agreement. "What do you need from me?" Mabel asked. "Come back in 4 days," Clara said. Mabel left the cow and drove her wagon back the way she had come. The cow began producing milk on the 5th day. Mabel Stone told people, in the specific, efficient way that information travels in rural communities where everyone's livelihood depends on the same set of variables, where a neighbor's sick animal is not an abstract concern, but a data point that has direct relevance to your own risk assessment. She told people what she had seen and what had happened and how long it had taken. She did not editorialize. She presented the facts and allowed the facts to carry their own weight, which in this case was considerable. Wade Aldrich came from the North property 3 days after Mabel's report. He was 52 years old, lean and sparse of speech, a man whose respect was not available by purchase or by sentiment, but only by demonstration. He had a young horse with a fever that had not responded to anything he had tried. He tied the animal to the Holt fence post and stood back and watched Clara work with the expression of a man who is giving something the full and fair audit of his attention before he decides what he thinks about it. He did not speak while she worked. He did not ask questions while she explained the treatment protocol and the timeline he could expect. When it was over and he was preparing to leave the horse in Clara's care for the week, he stopped beside Elias at the paddock fence and looked at Cooper moving in the morning light. He said 4 words. "Keep her, she stays." Then he mounted and rode north. Elias looked after him for a moment and did not respond because the thing Aldrich had said did not require a response so much as it required sitting with, which was what he did. The Henderson family sent their youngest boy with a pair of sick hens in a crate. Then old Murphy came from the east property with a calf that could not stand. Then a family Clara had not met the Praters from the South Road arrived with a goat that had been refusing feed for 2 weeks. Elias stepped aside for all of them. He did not announce Clara or introduce her with explanations of her qualifications. He simply moved out of the way and let her work, and he remained near enough that anyone who looked would understand his position, which was behind her and supporting, not in front of, and permitting. There was a considerable difference between those two arrangements, and the people of Kerr County, who were observant in the ways of people who depend on accurate reading of the world around them, understood which one they were looking at. Dr. Warren Cole arrived on a Thursday morning 14 days after the storm. He did not come alone. Sheriff Roy Atkins rode beside him, which was not an arrangement that Cole had proposed or welcomed. Atkins was 45 years old, methodical and fair, a man who had not sought complexity in his tenure as sheriff and had generally been rewarded with a reasonable absence of it. He had not sought this particular complexity either. Chester Boone had brought it to his office on a Monday afternoon, sitting in the straight-back chair across the desk and placing on the desk between them his memory of a label on a bottle and his certainty about what that memory implied, and Atkins had listened with the attention of a man who knows when he is hearing something that will require him to act. He had asked Cole to accompany him to the Holt Ranch. He had not presented it as optional. When the 2 horses came through the gate, Clara was on the porch steps. Mabel Stone was in the yard, having returned that morning to check on her cow and to bring a jar of butter as payment. Chester Boone was at the paddock fence. Wade Aldrich happened to be there, having come to retrieve his horse, which had recovered fully and was ready to travel. His presence was coincidental. His staying when he understood what was developing was not. Cole reined in his horse and looked at the paddock. Drummer was at the paddock gate. The horse was standing with his head over the top rail, in the way of horses that have opinions about the proximity of people, watching the arrivals with the alert interest of an animal that has come back from somewhere far away and finds the ordinary world newly interesting. His coat had not recovered its full depth of color yet. He was still thinner than he had been before the illness. But he was there, and he was upright, and the specific quality of his presence at that fence communicated something that needed no translation. Cole looked at Drummer for a long time. Elias came out of the stable and walked across the yard to where Cole had stopped his horse. They looked at each other across the short distance between them, with the particular quality of regard that exists between 2 people when one of them knows that the other one knows something, and both of them are aware of this arrangement without having yet spoken directly about it. "I heard the horses recovered," Cole said. His professional voice was intact. He was using it deliberately with the care of a man who has maintained something for a long time and understands that it is the only tool he has left. 12 of 13, Elias said. Atkins dismounted and came to stand beside Cole's horse. Chester came away from the paddock fence and stopped at Elias's shoulder. Mabel Stone stayed where she was but turned to face the conversation. Aldrich moved without hurry to a position near the gate where he could see everyone clearly. Cole Atkins said, "I need you to tell Mr. Holt what you told me." Cole sat on his horse for a moment. He looked at the assembled faces, the specific arrangement of people who had gathered around this moment without planning to, drawn by the gravity of something unresolved that had been waiting too long for resolution. He looked at Clara on the porch steps. She was watching him with the level, patient attention she gave to everything that required careful observation, without hostility, without triumph, with the simple directness of a person who is prepared to hear the truth spoken aloud. He dismounted. He was a man of professional dignity, and he maintained it even now, getting down from his horse with care, straightening his coat, standing in the yard of the Holt Ranch with his hat in his hands. When I was here 3 weeks ago, he said, I recognized some of what I was seeing. Not all of it, but some. Elias waited. I had seen similar presentation before. 4 years ago, the Richardson cattle. Chester said nothing. He had already said his part in the sheriff's office and did not need to repeat it here. I was not certain what caused it in the Richardson case until after the herd was gone. When I investigated afterward, I found evidence of copper contamination in the water source, the old Black Rock mine, the same mine that feeds this watershed. He paused. I understood at that point that the prophylactic treatment I had administered to the Richardson cattle may have contributed to the severity of the outcome. And when I came here 3 weeks ago and saw what was happening to your horses, I recognized the pattern. The yard was very quiet. A horse moved somewhere in the stable. The mockingbird in the cedar breaks to the north had gone silent, as though listening. You recognized it, Elias said. Yes, and you told me to pray. A longer silence this time. Cole looked at the hat in his hands. I was not certain enough to say so with confidence. If I said it and I was wrong, I was accusing myself of something I might not have done. Cole stopped. He looked up. He was a man who had spent 23 years being the person who was consulted, who was deferred to, who was trusted with the weight of other people's losses and their hopes for what might be recovered. He looked like a man who understood that the weight he had been trusted with had not been carried honestly. I am not asking you to accept that as a sufficient explanation. I am telling you what was true. The thing that sits between a reason and an excuse, Clara said from the porch steps. She said it without heat, a quiet observation offered without cruelty, is whether anyone else paid the price of it. Bella paid it, Elias said. His voice was flat, not raised. Flat in the way of a statement that does not require emphasis because it is simply true. One other paid it before Cole turned away from the gate one morning and told me the best I could do was pray. Nobody spoke. He is not an evil man, Elias continued. He said this in the same flat voice. I have thought about it. Evil would be easier to understand. He is a man who is afraid of what the truth would cost him, and he decided his cost was worth more than my horses. That is something he will have to carry. I cannot put it down for him. Atkins had been listening with the specific quality of attention that is the job of people who have to decide what justice looks like in a situation where the law is not entirely clear about the edges of its own jurisdiction. He looked at Cole. The county medical board will review the Richardson case. In this case, both Atkins said. That is already in motion. Cole, I need you to provide your records from both treatments. Cole nodded. He nodded with the specific quality of a man who has been told what is going to happen next and has decided that the remaining dignity available to him lies in accepting it without argument. He put his hat back on. He looked at Drummer at the paddock gate. He looked at the horse for 3 or 4 seconds with an expression that Clara, who had spent a long time learning to read what faces carried underneath what they showed, understood to be genuine. Whatever else was true about Warren Cole looking at the horse he had expected to lose and finding it still present had cost him something real. He mounted and rode toward Kerrville without further conversation. Atkins watched him go. Then he turned back to Elias. I will be in touch, he said. He looked at Clara. I have heard about your work here, Miss Bennett. From several people. She said nothing, which he seemed to take as an appropriate response. He rode out through the gate. The yard settled back into its ordinary morning. Chester Boone exhaled a long, slow breath, the specific exhalation of a man who has carried something for 4 years and has finally put it down at the right place. I should have done that a good while ago, Chester said. You did it when it mattered, Elias said. Chester, that is what counts. Chester nodded. He looked at the gate and then at the house and then at Clara, and he gave her the brief direct nod of a man acknowledging a debt that he knows he cannot fully repay, but intends to recognize honestly. Then he went to get his horse. Mabel Stone had watched all of this from the same spot in the yard, and when it was over, she looked at Clara with the expression she had arrived with on her first visit, the expression of a woman auditing something against the standard of her own experience. You handled that well, Mabel said. She paused. For someone who has not been here very long. Clara looked at her. I am learning the place, she said. It takes time. Mabel nodded as though this were a satisfactory answer. She picked up her butter jar from the fence post where she had set it and carried it to the porch and put it inside the front door. Then she went to her wagon and drove away with the straightforward efficiency of a woman who has accomplished what she came to do and sees no reason to linger past the end of her business. In the weeks that followed, Warren Cole no longer practiced veterinary medicine in Kerr County. The county medical board's review of both cases was a process that took time and produced a document that was filed in the courthouse and was available for anyone who wished to read it. Some people in the county felt the outcome was too lenient. Some felt it was too severe. Elias did not have a strong opinion either way. He had said what was true in the yard of his ranch on a Thursday morning with people present who had heard it, and that was the part that had been owed and it had been paid, and he was not someone who required ongoing interest in what came after. What he was a man with fences to mend and a roof to repair and a well to deepen and a stable full of horses that were coming back to themselves one incremental morning at a time. He worked the way he had always worked from first light until the work was done, but with a quality to the work that had been absent for a long time. His father had described it once when Elias was young, this quality, in the specific plain language that Jacob Holt used for everything important. He had said there is work you do because you have to, and there is work you do because it means something, and a man is lucky if he can find a way to have both at the same time. Elias was finding his way back to both. The stable roof was repaired, not patched. Repaired properly with new boards and new roofing nails, and the attention to the underlying structure that Elias had been deferring since spring, and that he now gave completely working 2 full days on it because the job warranted 2 full days. He repaired the paddock fence along the north side where 3 posts had begun to lean. He dug the east well deeper, a full day's labor with Chester Boone, helping for the first 4 hours before his back made its opinion known, and he was reassigned to supervising from the fence, which he did with the committed attention of a man who takes supervisory responsibilities seriously. He repainted the front gate. He had not painted the front gate since the year before Ann died, when she had asked him to, and he had done it in an afternoon, and she had stood at the kitchen window watching, and afterward told him it looked like the gate of a place where people intended to stay. He painted it the same white she had chosen. It was not a sentimental decision. It was a practical one. White was what the gate had always been, and white was what it was going to be. Clara organized the kitchen in the way of a person who is not organizing a kitchen for temporary use. She found the places where things worked and put them there, and they stayed. She made the larder functional in the way it had not been functional since Anne's time, not merely stocked, but arranged with the logic of how a kitchen actually operates, rather than the logic of things placed wherever there was space. She dried herbs in the kitchen on lengths of string that she strung between the 2 high hooks that had probably been put there for exactly this purpose, yarrow and chamomile and peppermint and lavender, and the kitchen took on a smell that was entirely new to the house and entirely right for it. She planted a small kitchen garden at the south side of the house where the soil was deepest and the afternoon shade from the roof eave protected the tender plants from the worst of the summer heat. Tomatoes and squash and a row of green beans, and at the far end where the soil was sandiest, a section she left fallow for the moment, with the intention she had formed and had not yet shared. One evening in the last week of September, Elias came to her at the back of the house. He had been working on the small outbuilding behind the main structure for 3 weeks. He had not explained what he was doing with it, and she had not asked. She had observed the sounds of work coming from it in the evenings after dinner, the specific sounds of careful labor sawing and planing, and the occasional precise tap of a hammer, finding a nail squarely, not the sounds of a man hurrying through something, but of a man doing something he wants to do correctly. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him around the house to the back. He opened the door of the small outbuilding and stepped aside. She went in. The walls had been whitewashed with a lime mixture that had dried to a clean, even surface, the kind of white that takes the available light and distributes it generously. Shelves ran along both walls at a height that was right for reaching, built of oak boards, with the planned smoothness of wood that has been worked with patience, the shelves spaced to accommodate glass bottles of various sizes, and the kinds of books that are used rather than displayed. A work table sat under the single window on the west wall, A window that, at this hour of the evening, admitted a particular quality of late afternoon light, the golden light of a September sun descending toward the hills, coming in at the angle that made the surface of the table glow. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Then she saw what was on the table. In the center of the work surface, placed where the light from the window found it directly, was a small wind chime. Four horseshoes, old ones worn thin at the outer edges from years of use, connected by lengths of copper wire drawn fine and shaped with care. The wire was not the work of a craftsman trained for delicate things. It was the work of a man who had figured out how to do what he needed to do with the tools he had and the patience to get the result right. The horseshoes hung at intervals that allowed them to move independently, and when the evening air came through the gap at the top of the window, they turned and touched each other with a sound that was not the bright ring of decorative metal, but something quieter, the sound of old iron remembering weight and motion. She crossed to the table and touched one of the shoes with her finger. They moved and spoke against each other in the low, resonant voice of things that have carried something for a long time. "Drummer," she said. "His shoes from last spring," Elias said from the doorway. "When the farrier replaced them, I kept the old ones. I did not know why." He paused. "I thought you might want something of his in a place where you work." She stood with her hands still resting against the wind chime, feeling the faint vibration of the metal through her fingertips. She turned and looked at him. He stood at the door with his hands at his sides in the posture of a man who has done something he cannot take back and is standing in the full presence of that fact. "This place is mine," she said. "Yours," he said. "The shelves, the table, the space." She looked around the room again. At the shelves that were exactly the right size for the bottles her grandmother had labeled and she had carried 1,000 miles. At the window with its evening light. At the whitewashed walls waiting. She looked back at him, why he was quiet for a moment. Not a difficult silence. The silence of a man choosing his words with the care they deserved. "2 Sundays ago," he said, "I mended the gatepost on the north side. The one that has needed mending since April. I finished late in the afternoon and I stood there for a few minutes looking at what I had done, and I wanted to come inside and tell someone that I had finished it." He stopped. "I wanted to say it out loud to another person. Not because it was important, because that is what a person does when a day goes well. They tell someone about the small thing that went right." He looked at her steadily. "I have not had someone to tell things like that to in 6 years. Since Anne. And I realized standing at that fence post that the reason I wanted to come inside and say it out loud was because you were inside." He stopped again. "Not because you saved the horses, not because of anything that happened in an emergency, because you are someone I want to tell the small things to. That is not something I have felt in 6 years, and I am not a man who misidentifies what he feels." She looked at him in the evening light of the small, whitewashed room. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not because of the letter, not because I need someone to keep the house, because this ranch came alive again while you were in it, and I do not think that would have happened without you, and I do not want to go back to the version of it that existed before you came." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking because you think you owe me something?" "No." He said it without pause. "I am asking because when I think about next year and the year after that, I want you in them. That is the full extent of my reasoning." She looked at her hands, the hands that had held Drummer's jaw through the worst night of the storm, the hands that carried her grandmother's knowledge and her father's belief that what you know is worth the trouble of knowing. The hands that had been doing the work they were built for finally in this particular place in the Texas Hill Country. "I already stayed," she said. "The question was whether you were going to notice." He exhaled, not a sigh, the specific exhalation of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has finally found the safe place to put it down. He had noticed. That evening after the animals were seen to, and the kitchen was clean, and the light had gone fully from the sky, they sat on the west porch together in the 2 chairs that had been on that porch since Jacob Holt built it and that had waited through years of single occupancy for this ordinary arrangement to become possible again. The hill country dark settled in from the east, first the way darkness always comes from the east. In Texas, moving across the sky like a second and more permanent sky behind the first one. The stars arrived in the clusters then, in the dense, overwhelming abundance that the hill country sky produces on clear nights after rain has passed through and cleaned the atmosphere. Stars so numerous and so bright that the sky ceased to look like absence and began to look like presents. Drummer's wind chime on the porch railing, where Elias had moved it after showing it to her, spoke softly in the evening air. My father would have liked this country, Clara said. He always said that a wide sky keeps a person honest about their own size. Elias looked out at the pasture. He would have been right about that. He was right about most things. She said it without weight. It was simply true, and she had made her peace with the particular unfairness of the fact that being right had not been sufficient to protect him. Chester Boone was playing his accordion on the neighboring property. The sound traveled across the open ground with the fidelity that sound achieves over flat country. At night, the old Tennessee melody that had no name that Chester knew of, only the tune itself which his father had played, and his grandfather before that, and which had traveled from Nashville to this particular hillside in Texas by no route that anyone had thought to document. It sounds like something coming home, Clara said. Chester has been playing it every Saturday evening for 40 years, Elias said, since before I was born. My father told me once that the first time he heard it when they were new to this land and everything about it was still unfamiliar. That song from across the fence line made him feel like the country was welcoming him, like it was telling him he was in the right place. She listened to it for a moment, still beautiful even without knowing its name. Yes, he said, it is. She turned her head toward him and found that he was looking at her with an expression that he had stopped trying to arrange into anything other than what it was. She met his eyes in the dark and did not look away. He placed his hand over hers on the armrest between their chairs. She turned her palm upward, and his fingers found hers the same arrangement as the morning after the storm, the same easiness of it, the same quality of two things settling into a position they had been approaching. Neither of them spoke for a while. The accordion continued its old song across the dark. The stars continued their work. Drummer moved quietly in the paddock, visible as a shape in the dark, present and steady. I want to plant lavender in the spring, Clara said, on the south side where the soil is sandiest. Your grandmother ever grow lavender here? He thought about it. No, she tried sage. It did not take. Lavender takes better in sandy soil, and it keeps insects away from the kitchen garden. I will dig the bed before the ground hardens in November, he said. You do not need to do that. I know I do not need to, he said. I want to. She looked at him in the dark and understood something. It was the same thing he had understood in her earlier standing at the fence post with the mended post in front of him and the impulse to tell someone about it pulling at him. The small intentions, the specific plans for a specific future that only means something when you are making them with someone who is also going to be there. They were making them. The night moved around them at its own pace, which was unhurried and vast in the way of Texas nights that have a great deal of sky to fill and take their time about filling it. Chester's melody completed itself and began again, as it always did, because the best melodies do not stop, they return. The fire Elias had banked low in the kitchen stove would hold until morning. The horses in the stable were breathing in the regular, reliable rhythm of animals that have returned to the business of simply living. The Holt Ranch lay quiet under its enormous sky, the land that Jacob Holt had broken with his hands, and Elias Holt had held through every variety of loss and drought and solitary season, the land that did not forgive carelessness, but did not forget faithfulness either. The land that had waited along with everything else for this particular evening to become possible. Some things begin with sickness, some begin with storms. Some begin with a short letter written on cheap paper by a woman in Ohio who had nowhere left she wanted to be, and a man in Texas who had run out of reasons to expect tomorrow to be different from today. And the best ones, the ones that hold through seasons and years, do not end. They simply find the ground they were always meant to grow in, and they put down roots.